Gabby Goldstein back again. I really like talking to her. I love her organization, and I specifically think their focus is the focus that matters because it's specific, and I think it's sustainable and long-term. And we're talking about all kinds of issues regarding women's rights. So thank you, Gabby, for joining me again.
Happy to be here, Pete. Thank you.
So you were in D.C. You were at the Supreme Court during oral arguments. Was it last week on the latest on the Mississippi case when it comes to abortion? And I wanted you to kind of lay that out for me, how you saw that day and why you were there, and however you want to answer it in terms of where we're going after that you heard the arguments that day.
Yeah, so I live here in DC and take every opportunity I can to walk down to the mall or the Supreme Court and just be visible and present during important events and actions. So it was really important for me to walk down to the Supreme Court before oral arguments started in the Dobbs case last week. This, of course, is the case that's pending in the Supreme Court dealing with the constitutionality of a Mississippi law from 2018 that essentially bans abortions after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy. Of course, that is a lot longer than other states have now put their ban into place. Texas, of course, being a state that has banned abortion at 6 weeks, plus a snitch bounty. And the Supreme Court hasn't blocked that case, so that ban is currently in effect in Texas. But this Supreme Court case that's pending that's pending now is, seen by many as the case that is likely to either overturn Roe v. Wade or really, really limit it. And it is part of a broader conservative strategy in jurisprudence and in general to narrow the federal protections that the Constitution allows and gives us, and to expand states' rights. That is a long-term project of movement conservatism and conservatives. And this case is just one in a long legacy of cases where conservative courts are curtailing our federal rights and giving more power to states to decide really important issues.
Yeah, it's so much about the courts. It's so much about the judges on those courts. And then beyond that, it's so much about the activism that got those judges on those courts, including, getting President Trump elected and Mitch McConnell reelected so he could do what he did. And you've got 3 new justices appointed to the Supreme Court by Donald Trump. And I just wanted to get a word on that in terms of the percentage of Americans in terms of attitudes towards abortion, women's reproductive rights in general, who I think the specific question has to be, even if they hate abortion and they're against abortion, still think that it should be legal. I think that's where we get it wrong on the polling question. So the percentage of Americans that think abortion should be legal versus what this court is deciding is really out of balance, is my understanding. Fair to say?
Yeah. Absolutely. A majority of Americans, a healthy majority of Americans, think that abortion should be legal. What we have is a conservative movement that has engineered their way into being insulated from public opinion. That is the consequence of gerrymandering in Congress. We have extreme polarization both in our state houses and in Congress that allows politicians to be insulated from what their voters actually want. And it's also the consequence of a long-term project on the right to train and install conservative judges at state level and the federal level, which are also insulated from the public's opinion. So we have systems of government that are fully captured by ideologues that do not at all match the preferences of voters.
And this situation is created because of conservative activism, anti-abortion activism. They call it pro-life. I don't. And you and your organization, Sister District, sisterdistrict.com, donate now, are the opposition to that. You are organizing and you're doing it now for 2022. Gabby, I wanted to take some time off. And apparently the message is we don't really get time off.
No, There's no time off. Sorry, not sorry. It's all hands on deck. Um, yes. So my organization, my co-founders and I started this organization with the goal of building progressive power in state legislatures. We saw this as a critically overlooked venue of power for progressives. State legislatures are our policy pipeline, our leadership pipeline. Half of all members of Congress started in their state ledge, and they are critically important, vital keys to fair districts, voting rights, repro justice issues. Let's remember that gerrymandering is a creature of state law. It doesn't come from anywhere else. It doesn't come from Congress, doesn't come from the president. It comes from state legislatures. So we really wanted to focus on building power at this level of the ballot. We always say, I hate to say that progressives are tardy to the party when it comes to paying attention to state legislatures. The conservative movement has been at this game for decades and decades. They realized long ago that state legislatures are extremely important. These are cheap races. They toil in obscurity. No one pays any attention to them, and they're really easy to pick off if you're a Republican. So they've been at this game for decades, and we're really coming from behind. And, I was saying before, there are these broader trends in the courts, and in regulation and all sorts of things that are limiting federal protections and giving more power back to states. So it's at this critical point that we really have to invest in our state legislatures, which is what my organization does. And yeah, that's exactly right. No off years. Next year is, let's just say, one other thing about state legislatures that I think it's kind of an emerging issue. Enough people are not talking about this enough. This is something that Dave Daly and I wrote about a few months ago for Salon, which is there is this legal theory called the independent state legislatures doctrine, which is a conservative hatched legal theory that's been making its way through the courts that essentially says that the Constitution, the federal Constitution, gives state legislatures the sole authority to decide election law and declare victors of elections.
Yeah.
And this theory, they are teeing it up for 2024.
Yes.
So that conservative state legislatures in places like Wisconsin and Arizona and Pennsylvania can decide who the winner is of the 2024 presidential election, regardless of the votes in those states.
Yes.
And I'll tell you
that on the show with constitutional law scholar Eric Siegel, and Dave Daly is awesome. I'm psyched to hear that you guys are. I'll go look at that column and share it. But I interrupted you, but it's such a scary and important point, because why?
Because that means that the will of the people will be 100% jettisoned, disregarded, set aside, and the interests of the Republicans will be the only thing guiding who ends up in the White House in 2024. And next year, 2022, is our last chance to elect Democrats to state legislatures to block this from happening. This is an existential moment that you probably had a similar conversation with the law professor that you just mentioned, the legal scholar. This is our last chance before 24. 2022 is our last chance to change the composition of state legislatures before they will essentially get to decide. They'll try to decide the 2024 presidential election.
And we just heard from the guy who lost his Senate race, but is now running for governor to primary a guy who's already a Trumper. This is just so insane. But David Perdue running to primary Brian Kemp in Georgia. And he said in an interview, I think yesterday, he would not have voted to confirm the election of 2020, which is what you're talking about. Like, if he were governor, he would not have been, I'm not sure how much power the governor has versus the legislature, but he's saying that right now. It's a hypothetical, but it's a really important point. Let me go back to another point that you made, though, in terms of state elections are cheap. And my understanding is the right, special interests on the right, and organizations like the Koch brothers and ALEC and others have been spending lots of money on these cheap state legislatures. Whereas on the left, or on the progressive movement, we don't even really have that kind of money because it's corporate money more than anything else. And we're like, trying to advocate for poor people or the environment or issues that don't have like a lot of corporate money behind them, and these fancy fundraisers. Just always been the case. It probably always will be the case. So am I right to say how the money has gotten to those state races on the right, and how do we get that money to state races in the progressive movement?
I'm pulling down one of my very favorite, extremely dog-eared books that I have read probably half a dozen times, which is Dark Money by Jane Mayer.
Yeah.
Highly recommend if folks have not read this book. Extremely, extremely important book that basically goes through the history of how we ended up in this situation where the conservatives have this very streamlined, very well orchestrated set of institutions that fund and support conservative judges and candidates and causes. And on the other hand, the progressives have a much larger and more diffuse set of institutions. And in many ways, this is great, right? A thousand flowers bloom. We have fantastic issue advocacy organizations that are working so hard on particular issues and all the rest. But it creates a coordination problem on our side that makes resource allocation just much more diffuse, right? Versus what happens on the right, which is extremely streamlined, really just a big handful of very rich family foundations and corporate interests control the political strategy on the right. And that's a very effective strategy for them.
So Sister District is doing what specifically on what issues? I mean, because you just laid it out perfectly in terms of how diffuse we are. What are the issues that your organization is focused on, and what is the strategy between now and 2022 elections?
Yeah. So we focus exclusively on state legislatures. As I mentioned, this is a very, very overlooked venue of power, and it's a great return on investment for volunteer time and donations and all the rest. And so we do this we have a network of over 60,000 volunteers across the country, and each year we endorse a set of state legislative candidates in key critical battleground chambers. And we help them win through field and fundraising and professional services that we provide. And in addition to that field and fundraising candidate facing work, we also work directly with progressive state legislators once they're elected to make sure that they have the resources that they need to be successful, including we run the only national network of purple district state legislators, progressives, so folks in frontline seats who have flipped their seats from red to blue or who just won by just a little bit. So we have a network of those folks who are able to come together and share best practices, ideas around policy, governance, really try to create some community so that we can exchange good information across states from the legislator perspective. So we're trying to attack this from different angles, both helping folks get elected and then helping folks, great, diverse, progressive state legislators succeed once they're in office. And next year is going to be a real battle. I mean, we know that historically speaking, the presidential party does not do well in the midterm elections, right? That's just a historical fact, which means that the enthusiasm and the motivation of the out party, the party that's not in the White House, tends to be bigger during midterms. And that's what we're fighting against next year. So when you said you hope to take some time off, no, my friend, next year we have to out enthusiasm, out motivate the Republicans if we want to hold on to the House and if we want to hold on to and grow power in our state legislatures. Again, last chance on state legislatures before the 2024 election.
It seems like the argument last week at the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, who shouldn't be on the court, made this long argument about precedent and how the Supreme Court has overturned, which is different than what he said in his confirmation hearing, but how the Supreme Court over history has overturned so many cases. But the difference here, of course, is this is this would be taking a right away versus giving a right. And I think that, I don't know, you and I are probably around the same age ish. And growing up in America in the last 30 or 40 years, we overwhelmingly had more rights, as at least women did, when it came to reproductive rights. We were gaining rights during our lifetime. To see my daughters, this generation of women or humans in America losing rights, putting aside reproductive rights for a second, voting rights. The fact that we're losing rights is as a result of a long, long, hard fought strategy on the right in many different ways. So the question is, in terms of like timeline, Gabby, we kind of we have to be this, we have to be in this for our life. I didn't want to be fighting to keep rights we already won. I wanted to fight to keep gaining more rights. But it's just so frustrating to get set back, given what I said in terms of context about our lifetime and rights in general. But that's what we're talking about. We're in this for the rest of our lives at this point, based on elections and timelines and the current paradigm, it would seem.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. I mean, the conservative strategy can be reduced to two words, right? Government bad. Government bad. What are
Yes,
our two
yes,
words?
yes,
Like,
yes, yes.
not exactly sure what our two words are, but that's it. Government bad. And one way government bad is the idea of strong federal rights. And so the civil rights movement and all of the legislation that came out of that was really an effort to expand federal rights, right? To interpret our Constitution in a way that is most inclusive and most expansive. And the conservative strategy has been since, and even before and since, to narrow and narrow and narrow what the federal rights are that we have, the interpretation of our Constitution
Right.
in a narrow way. And so that's what we're fighting against. And it is it is a long, long strategy, and it's taken them many decades to really see this come to fruition, especially now with the composition of the Supreme Court. The other thing I would just say is that on our side, this is something that beloved progressive messaging expert Anat Shenker-Asario says all the time. If you haven't had her on your show, you should. She's a delight, and she's a beloved in progressive messaging. What she always says is, we can't just be against deplorable stuff. We have to be for stuff too, right? We can't just be against what the conservatives are doing. We can't just be against Donald Trump. We can't, but we have to have an expansive, beautiful vision of the world that would happen if we had power. And I think that something that's a bee in my bonnet and something that I'm really focused on is building the case for a progressive federalism. The idea that states' rights can be good for people too. They don't, states have a lot of power, and we have to learn to tell the story about the great things that states can and do. And the good news is there's lots of great stuff that states are doing in the areas of expanding reproductive justice issues, environment, anything, education, etc. But this is a gap in our narrative that progressives have to start filling, is creating a good vision of the world that would happen if we did have control of more state legislatures and if we did have progressive policies coming from our states. So that's just the other piece in the long term, thinking long term. We have to be in this forever. There is no finish line. And in addition to fighting back against what the conservatives are doing, we also have to present this beautiful vision of the world that can and will happen when we have power.
Who is that person?
Oh, and Anat Shenker-Asario. She's absolutely fantastic. She has a podcast called Words That Win, and she works a lot with the progressive movement on messaging strategy. And she's
Awesome.
she's great. Highly recommend having her on to talk messaging.
I will. And I really appreciate you joining me to talk about all of your work at Sister District. Any kind of action item you want to leave me and listeners with?
Yeah, please join
Outside of
us.
donating to this great nonprofit, sisterdistrict.com, and joining their fight.
Yes, it's a great time to join us. We have over 150 teams across the country, and so we probably have one near you. And our teams, obviously pandemic world, but they get together and either by Zoom or hopefully again in person to make phone calls, hold fundraisers for our candidates, write postcards, send text messages, all of that good stuff to help elect wonderful, progressive candidates for state ledge who are building towards a reflective democracy that we want to see. So we would love to have you join us. It's a great time to get involved, and as I said, next year is absolutely critical. We have to spare a thought for state ledge, given how much attention and focus will be put on federal races and gubernatorial races, which of course very very important. But in our volunteering portfolio, let's all make a little bit of room for state ledge. A little bit goes a long way at this level of the ballot.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I'm also myself trying to talk with more current policymakers in at the state level. I'm going to be joined by a Michigan state legislature named Senator McMorrow over the
Oh,
weekend.
Mallory. We love Mallory.
Yeah,
She's a
you know,
sister
Mal, I
district
think.
alum.
Oh,
Yeah, she came through our program.
I wasn't sure if she did or not, so I didn't. I just thought of it as you're talking there. But send me anybody else that's currently working in government, because I think part of that message that you think needs to be sent, which I agree with. I think that's a great way of saying it, is talking to people actually doing the work right now. And so those people don't get nearly enough media coverage in their own districts, states, much less nationally. So I'm always happy to talk with any of these folks, and hopes that they will. So definitely send them my way. And Gabby, thank you as always for joining me. You're such a smart, passionate, inspiring leader, and your organization is amazing. I'm really, really glad whenever I get to talk to you.
Thanks, Pete.